I have, over the years, spent so much energy engaging in textual sermons against the atrocity of a game known as Bioshock Infinite that someone finally suggested I make a more thorough analysis of the game's failings. So, I decided to try. Let's talk about Bioshock Infinite. A game considered masterful by many in its meaning, in its storytelling, in its big twist. No piece of media, of course, should ever be evaluated in any ultimate sense by the way others receive it, so I'm not going to hold it against the game that it's well received. Other narratives, like that Infinite is a poor Bioshock title, but a great game, which hinge basically upon expecting things of Infinite according to its name, according to the franchise it comes from, aren't interesting to me either. However, it is true that comparing Infinite to the first two titles in the series will prove helpful in understanding Infinite's mistakes. I don't intend either to make the gameplay central to this analysis. We'll talk about it, of course, but plenty of people have discussed the game's mediocre shooting, mechanical fluff, and actually let's just talk about the gameplay right now. I want to be clear that Infinite isn't much fun. Gone from the previous games, as many will point out, are different ammo types. Gone are various gen tonics that passively change gameplay. Gone are hacking minigames. Gone are a great variety of weapons to use and upgrade. What's left over? Is it any good? No, it really isn't. It's an arena shooter with a 2-weapon limit, but it clumsily has a weapon upgrade system anyways, so you'll find yourself dropping the guns you've invested in once you're short on ammo. Where the other Bioshock games scaled back the complexity of the System Shock titles in resource management, skills, and RPG elements, Infinite has finally stripped it all away. Now you have a shield, and looting is an even more tertiary activity than before. It seems out of place. The enemies are basically just bullet sponges, the shooting feels flaccid, and the rail lines are a lame gimmick that don't add much to the game. In fact, far from creating a mobile shooter playground, like the developer intended, the rails are really the only thing that save Infinite's combat sections from being arduous chores. Instead, they're just chores. Kill some guys here, hop on the rail and kill the ones over there, rinse and repeat. Elizabeth's combat tears are similarly dull. Far from tactical choices, they play much more like press button, receive benefit. Or in some cases, there's simply no use for them at all, and they exist only to make the game appear to offer more than it really does, which is a nice analogy for what the game is doing as a whole. In reality, there's not really too many different ways to play Infinite. It's kind of a slog. The vigors, too, are samey and not incredibly needed in combat. You can go through the game ignoring them until the game arbitrarily declares you need a particular one. Even if one is willing to praise Infinite for its storytelling, there's no avoiding the reality, especially in a subsequent playthrough, that this is not a terribly fresh or engaging shooter. But that's all really neither here nor there. Most people acknowledge that Infinite's gameplay is less than amazing. I first played the game upon its release, and trying to give the game a fresh look and avoid any past biases, I have replayed it now. Centrally, what is Bioshock Infinite about? What is it doing? What is it saying? Before we delve further, let me clarify a little more what value I see in stories, generally speaking. We love stories because we see ourselves in them. We see human beings in stories. And it is my belief that stories and telling stories find their rightful place in telling things about us, in reflecting our own image back to ourselves, whether it be a simple or complex message. Whether philosophical, religious, political, entertaining, or humorous, stories must do this. And it is with the content of the reflection, what image the stories show of us, that I am most interested. My thought is expressly teleological about this. We're asking, what is the game's purpose, and is that purpose good? It's not enough to point out that Infinite looks to do X, Y, and Z, and succeeds, as one can reasonably question if X, Y, and Z were laudable goals. So, to repeat myself, what image does Bioshock Infinite reflect back? And is that image a good one? What is Bioshock Infinite about? One answer, one telos one might assign to the game, is that Infinite is attempting to do what it plainly reveals itself to be doing in its last half hour, which is to say that it's trying to tell the story of a father who sold his daughter to wipe away a gambling debt. The way Infinite chooses to tell this story is through a lot of sci-fi fantasy about parallel universes, a floating city, a pair of quantum twins, and a load of ham-fisted window dressing about race, religion, and communism. Of course, therein really lies the trouble. Infinite really isn't telling that story during its first 10 hours. It's delivering its less than nuanced pseudo-commentaries on religion, race, and revolution. Pseudo-commentary is really the best way I can describe much of these early portions of the game, where the narrative hook, at least for the first-time player, is that Booker is a mercenary hired to deliver Elizabeth to New York. Let's talk about the game's beginning a bit. While one might admire the way that the game appears to be hinting at its later revelation and telling you to bring us the girl and wipe away the debt, I disagree with such praise. Besides the opening quote about manufactured memories, the player is given little reason to cast doubt upon the facts the game tells them, upon the game's narration as it's presented. Additionally, Booker's motivations, reason for wanting to find Elizabeth, and whatever debt he needs to pay sit so far in the background during the game that the player hardly ever needs to think about them. The game's events and goals, which mostly consist of filler, never seriously ask the player to call into question Booker's own motivations. Which is too bad. If they did force the player to question Booker's position, force the player to seriously question reality as the game presents it at first throughout the game, instead of only in its last 30 minutes, then it'd be a more consistent experience. What happens instead? What does the game spend its time doing until it reaches that point? Even more importantly, if the rest of the game isn't the same mind-bending and reality-questioning experience that the very end of it is, then why isn't it? What happened? What is it instead, and why? To find out, let's look at some other things in the opening. After the little sequence at the lighthouse, with its obnoxiously stupid puzzle, the player is bombarded with explicitly religious, clearly Christian imagery and aphorisms. As in the original Bioshock, the player is getting a little preview of the city's ideology here. However, unlike the first game, Infinite has no intention of turning aphorisms and imagery shoved in the player's face into a believable city. Infinite isn't really interested in opening up any sort of dialogue or engagement with the idea of theocracy, or with exploring the consequences it might have upon the people living under it. It's basically just a way of grabbing the player's attention, because Levine knows that this stuff sounds gripping. Where Andrew Ryan asks you, is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow, inviting the player to seriously ponder questions of economic justice and what it means to be entitled to something, Bioshock Infinite literally baptizes you, not because it wants you to ask serious questions about sin and redemption, but because it wants the player to believe it's being meaningful by making a reference to religion. This goes just the same for the way the game treats its characters and all of the people in it. They're not even remotely human. They're just stock archetypes, cutouts without nuance, hilariously vapid in their every movement and display. Let's look at some of them. Comstock is the game's representative of religion, and the game uses its religious imagery to communicate that he wants Elizabeth to ascend the throne and lay fire upon the mountains of man. He wants to lay waste to the Sodom below. He clearly seems to want to kill those he views as sinful, which I guess is everyone outside of Columbia. A not particularly fascinating motivation, but the game could expand on it. I can't wait for the game to flesh out those murderous motivations, to give us a full-throated picture of the xenophobic, racist, and theocratic ideology that such a man must espouse. I can't wait to get a window into the mind of such a man, into the ethos of the city that follows him, I thought to myself, playing the game 5 years ago, awaiting something that the game never delivers. He bears the title Prophet in the city, but his power to foresee is by way of the quantum technology that his Lutece scientists invent. These two facts, put together on their own, almost paint some incredibly dull black and white picture of religion evil, science good, but that's only my effort to squeeze out some meaning in the portrait the game gives us. The game never goes to the effort to even set up that kind of dichotomy. Fact is, Comstock as a character really isn't anything more than hypocritical evil religious man. Perhaps, hidden within this incredibly dumb character, there's something to be said for our culture's, or Ken Levine's, inability to engage with religion in a more meaningful way than this. Who else rounds out our cast? In Jeremiah Fink, we find a similarly stupid and one-dimensional, evil, greedy businessman. He's introduced to the player, asking us to throw a ball at an interracial couple. What interesting commentary. If you look really closely, you can almost see that the game is trying to call our attention to the fact that Columbia is racist. Later, we meet him again in the town's factory district, where he, surprise, oppresses his workers. He encourages them to accept their place and isn't hesitant about using armed muscle to beat any worker that wants to unionize into submission. So, he's an entirely unsympathetic, ruthless capitalist. I can't wait to find out more about what motivates this man, why he does what he does, and why he believes what he believes. I'm just kidding. We don't get that either. In Daisy Fitzroy, we find a communist who wants to bring down Fink's oppression. Again, that sentence alone can really account for all of her character. The game takes an opportunity during this sequence for Elizabeth to express her belief that maybe Fitzroy can really change things for the better. What does the game have to say about that sentiment? Well, after Elizabeth and Booker leap through a couple tears, the communists are murdering everyone. Go figure. If anyone thinks this is any sort of meaningful commentary on revolutionary extremism, you're wrong. I'm sorry. In the same way that Comstock isn't a meaningful statement about religion, nor Fink about capitalism, nor is Fitzroy about communism. In the most generous possible interpretation, all these character portraits manage to communicate is that using religion to burn down New York is probably bad, oppressing your workers is bad, and killing children is also, surprise, bad. Wow, really raising the bar for writing games here, Ken. If you squint really hard, maybe you could try and argue that the game is saying that extremism is bad. But this is a poor argument, for the game hardly even gives us extreme ideologies. We're not engaged with ideologies in Comstock, Fink, and Fitzroy. We're engaged with mere sentiments. Sentiments as bare as, sin is bad, money is good, fight for the people. These are barely even coherent thoughts, and certainly not ideological. They're fake caricatures of ideologues. It's as if the game has created slightly uncanny, robotic versions of a hellfire preacher, a Gilded Age businessman, and a revolutionary laborer. The voxophones are hardly even the stories of real citizens who have their own problems, troubles, and thoughts about things in Columbia. Instead, they're just like the rest of the cast. They just reflect stock cutouts of the citizens you'd expect to populate this mirage of a city. The racist businessman says he doesn't like black people. The simple-minded woman turns up her nose at Latin. The experience of listening to any one of these is exactly the same experience of everything else this game presents. It's some plastic, not quite real picture of the subject material, as if it was made to look fake. Here I come to my real problem with the game. If Levine didn't want to engage with and explore ideology like the first two games did, why even dress it up in these garments at all? If he wanted to simply tell a story about a father who sinned and gave his daughter away, about his eventual redemption and setting things right, then why ruin that story by tying it to concepts that undermine it? Why? Why do that? If he really wanted to do that, and he wanted everything in the game to reflect that end, then what he could have done instead, what he should have done instead, is made the ideological themes so plainly plastic that no one could miss it. Make everything the game presents surrounding religion, capitalism, and revolution strikingly eerie for its plasticity. Make it so unavoidably clear that something else is going on, that the game isn't attempting to say anything meaningful about these themes, that the player has no choice but to question the reality of what they're seeing. I mentioned before that the main cast behaves like uncanny, robotic caricatures of the stereotypes they're representing, which, given what I just said, you'd think I would praise it for this. I said slightly, though. The game goes to all the effort in its presentation to treat the threats leveled at the player, at Elizabeth, and the city with real drama. The game clearly wants me to care, or thinks I care when Comstock delivers his theocratic rhetoric, when Fink talks about keeping the worker in his place, when Fitzroy talks about the people rising up. Which is strange. None of these things matter by the game's own premise. In another universe, one tear away, Comstock is a tolerant man. Fink pays his workers well, and Fitzroy negotiates with Fink as the head of the workers' union. So what if things are shit here? Isn't that just an inevitability in a multiverse? Questions like these, which are innumerable, never seem to cross the minds of our incredibly stupid protagonists who just trot along, accepting arbitrary objective after another, as if they're programmed to do it or something. So, why does the game present all of these matters as if they're important? If the cast is composed of juvenile stereotypes, hollow caricatures of real characters, then why is the tone urgent and dramatic? If the premise is farcical, then why am I being entreated to a thriller? Perhaps it's because, while trying to write a thriller, Ken Levine actually wrote a farce. Indeed, it's the fact that none of what is farcical about Infinite is intentional, that every time the game is trying to get me to take it seriously, I'm laughing at it, that makes me unable to praise it for it. Clearly, Ken Levine didn't mean for this to be laughably stupid, but it is. It's moments like these that really bring out the game's ridiculousness. The game even begins with this line, with Elizabeth asking, "Booker, are you afraid of God?" And he answers, "No, but I'm afraid of you." What does this even mean? It's clearly trying to sound profound, but what on earth is the game trying to get across with this exchange? Does Booker mean he thinks Elizabeth is like God? Is he afraid of her because she represents his own sin? The game clearly doesn't know what it wants the player to take away from it, and clearly it has no idea itself what this means. It's just like every other potentially thematically meaningful element in this game, shit thrown at the wall to see what sticks. It is true, as I said, that Infinite could have been a remarkable game had it intentionally sought to make itself absurd at every step, to clearly and obviously make itself plastic. Instead, it's stuck in the middle, pursuing diametrically opposed goals, trying to be serious, but with an intentionally and inherently absurd premise and almost satirical characters. On the flip side, if he had wanted to actually make something meaningful of Columbia, then he'd have to have created something drastically other than what Columbia appears to be. He'd need to have done the work of writing characters and sub-stories associated with them about how the city's theocratic racist regime had affected their lives, in every conceivable way, because that was what we got with the first two games in the series. How did those two games do it? Andrew Ryan had a backstory that justified his wanting to found Rapture, Sophia Lamb wanting to create the perfect collective. The story of Rapture's life and downfall in the first game is very much a story about the consequences of his objectivist, anarcho-capitalist ideology coming to total fruition. It was inevitable, as long as we maintain our suspension of disbelief, that Rapture's libertarian morality would allow for the creation of things like plasmids and Atom. It was inevitable that eventually a Frank Fontaine and Atlas would appear and beat Ryan at the market game. It was inevitable, thus, that eventually the great chain of industry would prove inadequate to maintain civic harmony. It was inevitable that Ryan would eventually have to resort to government force outside of and beyond the bounds of his limiting ideology. Rapture was to be a failed city from the beginning. Of course, in so offering that analysis, I am admitting my bias against libertarianism and against unconstrained capitalism. I'm not hiding that. The tragedy and sadness in Rapture's story consists in those characters who lived, thrived, and died in Rapture as this played out. The original game, like Infinite with Columbia and Comstock, has a story relating to the protagonist and his relation to the city, to Ryan. The difference in the way Bioshock 1 tells its story is that it doesn't preclude Rapture from seeming real. Bioshock 2 is also a story of a father seeking his daughter, albeit a much better one. Again, here, Sophia Lamb's desire to create her imagined utopia, and the means she's willing to use to do it, run against most conceptions of basic human dignity. We hear, in her own audio diaries and those of her followers, fleshed out reasoning as to why she wants to do this, why she believes and acts as she does. She is a real villain. Here, instead of serving as meaningless window dressing for a narrative that is about something diametrically opposed to ideological exploration, ideology serves to strengthen the central conflict of the narrative. Again, comparatively, ask yourself, what does Comstock really want? And why does he want it? The game has no answer besides, religions say he should burn society, haha. We're granted no exploration of Comstock's real religious beliefs, his reasoning for them, and why he acts and seeks the things he does. The very heart of the narrative Levine wanted to tell about Booker and his daughter Anna, and the way he wanted to tell it, through sci-fi quantum silliness, precluded and ran against any sort of ideological depth, against Columbia ever being real and meaningful. I don't think Levine entirely knew that, though. I think Levine was so preoccupied with including ideological commentary given the series' reputation for it, that he never noticed how terribly innocuous and vacuous all of it was. Or it could be that he just is himself a terribly innocuous and vacuous man. I don't know. Strangely enough, at other key points, it seems as though Levine designed Infinite knowing that his universe-hopping story would undermine choice, agency, in any sense that the here and now of people's lives in this city mattered. The Lutece twins routinely show up, behaving as though they have some mastery over time and space. They offer Booker and Elizabeth solutions to their immediate problems. By the way, these problems, which are never thematically engaging or meaningful, are always bare, boring practical problems, like getting a lot of guns, for instance, to appease a communist so she'll give you your airship back. I wonder, in this part of the narrative especially, how dumb the game thinks the player is. Do they expect the player to not ask the incredibly obvious question? To not ask why Elizabeth wouldn't just open a fucking tear to Paris? The exact rules about how Elizabeth's power works, why it works, if she's creating worlds or opening existing ones, are never clear, and it generally seems as though they change whimsically to suit the story. Questions like these, and there are a lot of them that can be asked of the story's presentation, hurt the game a lot. Anyway, whenever the Lutece twins show up and shift the goalposts slightly, they generally do so in a way that really isn't concerned with the here and now of what happens to this version of Columbia, or any particular version, really. They invite Booker and Elizabeth to forget about the fact that here and now, someone is dead. They encourage the two to remember that said person is probably alive in some other universe. These segments are also rage-inducingly stupid. It's as if the Luteces are some sort of comedy duo, here to make fun of our plainly retarded protagonists. Hey, you moron, remember the premise of the game? You can hop to other universes, you dumb cunt, is what they should say. Nevertheless, they always show up in a way the game presents as mysterious, and then reveals something the characters should have already known, in order so that our protagonists can eventually realize what they should have known all along. None of these arbitrary immediate goals matter. We need to go solve the quantum father-daughter baptism conundrum. Their presentation is especially at odds with the rest of the presentation. At every turn, they show up and dangle a thread before the player saying, "There's more going on here, but we won't tell you what it is." And the game asks the player, dramatically, to go shoot 500 guys so you can get a vigor to power a machine. The world hopping, and indeed the game's explicit forwardness about there being an infinite number of possible worlds, has to necessarily deflate any narrative tension about any particular person living or dying, any city thriving or coming to ruin, any individual finding freedom or rotting in prison. This problem isn't just a problem for Infinite, though. It's a problem any story that wants to do multiverse bullshit needs to overcome. And most don't. Eventually, the characters come to ask, wait, what does it matter if we escape here, or kill Comstock there? We won't have found freedom or demolished tyranny, because we're still imprisoned and the tyrant still lives somewhere else. This is the question that the characters eventually arrive at the end of the game. But up until that point, they're strung along in pursuit of pointless goal after pointless goal, and no progress is made toward any sort of real revelation. The closest thing we get to it are little lines of dialogue or nosebleeds signaling that maybe there's some history or details we don't know yet. The game really enjoys this. It dangles the possibility that maybe there's some further truth in front of the player to be discovered. But unlike a good story, like, say, Steins Gate, it just leaves us totally in the dark, and then, at the end, clumsily shoves the truth in front of the player, grinning, wanting us to pat it on the back for how clever it was, for how well it tricked us. At all these points, in all of its references to past, present, and future tense, to fate and choice, the game seems painfully aware of how little the actual here and now of Columbia matters. Yet, Levine didn't design the entire game around this awareness. I really do have to congratulate it on this mark, as my first experience of playing it was indeed a long march of expecting some further depth, some further nuance or shade of meaning to be revealed that would make all the rest of the inane bullshit you've done up to the end make sense, make it part of some greater whole. Indeed, to its credit, the game never reveals any such meaning. When it shows its hand early by hinting at something to be discovered, Bioshock Infinite has shown its hand completely. It isn't lying or bluffing, for it truly has nothing else to offer than the mere dangling promise, the possibility of discovering some new truth. Infinite has no concern with actually offering any substantive truth or meaning. It only wants you to believe that it might offer such a thing. The two characters stumble along throughout the narrative, similarly already knowing about the infinity parallel realities, but at the same time doggedly pursuing goals that clearly must not really matter in any grand scheme of things. The player should have, just given the concepts presented, already realized this. The game clearly thinks that we haven't, though. It talks to the player, to Booker, as if he just takes everything at face value, as if he needs every ounce of the story spoon-fed to him. And so, Elizabeth's tone changes and her eyes darken. She has realized the secret. Booker, you idiot. Don't you see that it doesn't matter? We didn't know the truth of all this. Really? Thanks for that ham-fisted narration there, Elizabeth. At least the actual game is starting now. And then it promptly ends. For, as I said, Infinite's game is really just to present us with the idea of revelation, not to actually reveal anything. I say this because revealing that Booker is Comstock, yada yada, lets world hop so we can solve everything by doing the special quantum baptismo drowning isn't a revelation. It's bullshit. The game believes it can salvage its narrative tension out of this tension-destroying concept by telling us some nonsense about how Comstock can be truly killed by killing him at the moment of his inception, at the baptism Booker turned down. Of course, as I've alluded to, wanting to stop Comstock is already a weak enough premise, as his motivations as a villain are so sparsely explored. By the end, I still don't know why I should really stop Comstock, other than because he wants to capture Elizabeth. It's not clear to the player why they shouldn't just world hop to somewhere far away from him, or to somewhere where he just doesn't exist at all. It's not really clear why we should even care that he exists in other worlds. Indeed, you might wonder if all the time the game spent giving the player tasks that didn't move the plot forward, and clumsily reminding us that there is a plot in the background with the Lutesses, wouldn't have been better spent answering these questions. Wouldn't have been better spent fleshing out the details, the hows and whys of Infinite's multiverse, of how it works, of how Elizabeth's powers work. Somewhere, buried beneath all of this pseudo-intellectual, pretentious bullshit, there's some meaning to be found in the fact that Booker being drowned is a sort of baptism that washes him of the sin of giving Anna away, of the mistake that supposedly caused the events of the game. I wish I could say that it linked up in any real way with all the game's other baptismal imagery, with the city's religious themes, but it doesn't. If someone else had written the game, perhaps they could have surmised that the entire experience of Infinite was one long baptism to wash Booker of his sins. If someone else had written the game, they might have thought to try and work that understanding into the player throughout the game, so that they might be left with some takeaway. Here again, I wonder, if this is indeed the best and most generous interpretation of the game, why Columbia wasn't designed entirely as an eerie, disturbing, and uncanny purgatory for Booker. Of course, even so, there's no getting around the fact that the multiverse aspect of this ruins the possibility of this ending being coherent or sensible anyways. As Matthew Matosis has pointed out, and I'll link his video below in the description if you've not seen it, infinite realities really does mean infinite. There's no possible way that this action here really resolves all possible worlds of Comstock ever existing. In another world, he could have gone back the next day and accepted the baptism and become Comstock, or become Comstock some other way. Indeed, here I wonder again, with the clumsy and unbelievable ways that Infinite employs multiverse theory, why didn't they just make Elizabeth someone who wields magical power? Why not make the supernatural elements exactly apportioned to the story you're trying to tell, and just be honest and straightforward about their convenience? Why introduce elements that break the story you're trying to tell, that require more complexity and careful nuance than your story is meant for or willing to do? Why do that? In this, we can see the truth of Bioshock Infinite as a game. In its telos, in its purpose, it is a failure as both a multiverse father rescuing daughter story, and as an ideological exploration of a city doomed to fall story. Why? Everything about this game tells the story of a writer, a creator who was either creatively bankrupt or totally lacked the focus to decide what he wanted this game to be. Even worse, we can see that in an attempt to salvage meaning from the multiverse design, Levine has tried to integrate the worlds of the other two games into Infinite, as retellings of the same story Infinite is trying to tell. To say that this is contrived is an understatement. I fail to see, additionally, why a multiverse setting was needed for this integration. A supernatural or openly fantastical setting would have been able to accomplish the same. At every turn, the multiverse element undermines the story's objective, its narrative tension, its characters, its settings, and its meanings. It seems probable that writing it as a multiverse story was a choice made because the multiverse was a fad at the time. And that's really too bad, because there's a lot of interesting ideas to play with here. You could definitely tell a lot of cool stories about a theocratic, racist city. You could tell an interesting tale about an irreligious father who sold his daughter, coming to that theocratic city to save her and atone. A stranger to faith, setting forth in a place of great faith to be washed of his sins. A man who rejects redemption, acting to redeem himself. It's a shame that Ken Levine didn't know how to tell that story. Thanks for watching.